$2,147,000. That is the exact number that separated Sarah Whitfield from a future and Sarah Whitfield from an ending. Not a metaphorical kind of departure, not the slow, poetic erosion that poets write about, the real kind. The kind where your muscles forget how to hold your skeleton upright. The kind where your lungs, one unremarkable Tuesday, simply decide they no longer want to participate. Ethan Caldwell sat in a fluorescent-lit office at Mount Sinai Medical Center, and he listened to a geneticist explain this number as though it were a weather forecast. Partly cloudy, chance of total system failure, $2.1 million. Have a nice afternoon. He held Sarah's hand. She squeezed back, and in that squeeze, in that silent, desperate compression of fingers, Ethan made a decision that would save his fiancée's life and destroy everything they believed they were. But that comes later. First, you need to understand who they were before the number, because what Ethan eventually did cannot be understood, cannot be judged unless you know the size of what he was trying to protect. Ethan and Sarah met the way ordinary people meet in a city that makes ordinary feel impossible. A mutual friend's birthday, a rooftop in Brooklyn, August, the kind of humid night where the skyline looks like it's melting. He was an accountant, not the glamorous kind, if such a thing exists. He worked for a mid-tier financial management firm called Hargrove and Bloom, handling pension fund administration for municipal unions, firefighters, sanitation workers, transit employees. He liked the precision of it. He liked that every column balanced. He liked that at the end of every quarter, the numbers proved that the world, at least on paper, was fair. Sarah was a physical therapist who specialized in pediatric rehabilitation. She worked with children recovering from spinal surgeries and traumatic brain injuries. She was the person who convinced a 7-year-old to take one more step when the 7-year-old wanted to quit. She was built for patience. She was engineered for hope. They fell in love quickly and without drama. Their relationship was not the kind that makes for thrilling television. It was the kind that makes for a good life. Sunday farmers markets, shared playlists, arguments about whose turn it was to call the landlord about the radiator. They were happy in the way that only people who have never been truly tested can be happy, completely, naively, and without any understanding of what happiness actually costs. Then, 14 months into their engagement, Sarah began dropping things. It started with a coffee mug, then her phone, then her keys, twice in the same morning. She laughed about it at first. Stress, she said. Wedding planning, she said. But Sarah was a physical therapist. She understood motor function the way Ethan understood balance sheets. And somewhere beneath the jokes and the excuses, she understood that her hands were not behaving the way hands are supposed to behave. The first neurologist said it was likely nothing. The second ordered a genetic panel. The third, the one at Mount Sinai, sat them both down and explained a term neither of them had ever heard before. Sarah had a rare monogenic neurodegenerative condition. To understand what that means, you need to understand how genetic disease works at its most fundamental level. Most common diseases, heart disease, diabetes, are polygenic. They involve dozens or hundreds of genes interacting with environment and lifestyle. Monogenic conditions are different. They are caused by a single mutation in a single gene, one error in 3 billion letters of genetic code, one misprint in a novel the size of 1,000 encyclopedias. In Sarah's case, that single mutation affected a gene responsible for producing a protein essential to motor neuron maintenance. Without this protein, her motor neurons would progressively degrade, her muscles would weaken, her coordination would fail. Eventually, her diaphragm, the muscle responsible for breathing, would follow. the timeline was uncertain. These conditions vary. Some patients decline over decades, some over years. But the trajectory was not uncertain. The trajectory was always down. There was, the geneticist explained, one option: a recently approved gene therapy, a one-time intravenous infusion that used a modified viral vector to deliver a functional copy of the defective gene directly into her cells. The therapy had shown extraordinary results in clinical trials, near complete halting of progression, in some cases, partial reversal of symptoms. It was, by every measure, a medical miracle. The cost of that miracle was $2.1 million. And Sarah's insurance, a standard employer-provided plan, classified the therapy as experimental and denied coverage. 3 appeals, 3 denials, 3 politely worded letters that explained with bureaucratic elegance that Sarah Whitfield's life did not meet the threshold for reimbursement. Ethan did what anyone would do first. He explored every legitimate option. He contacted the pharmaceutical manufacturer's patient assistance program. Sarah's income was $12,000 above the eligibility threshold. He reached out to nonprofit foundations that fund rare disease treatments. The wait lists were measured in years. He consulted attorneys about suing the insurance company. The attorneys explained that the denial was technically within the policy's contractual rights. Immoral, perhaps, but legal. Entirely legal. He started a crowdfunding campaign. It raised $41,000 in 4 months. Generous, meaningful, and roughly 2% of what they needed. Ethan sat in their apartment every night after Sarah fell asleep, and he did what accountants do. He ran the numbers. He calculated timelines. He stared at spreadsheets until the columns blurred and the figures became abstract shapes that no longer meant anything. And then, one night, the figures rearranged themselves into something that did mean something. He thought about the pension funds. If you've been watching this channel, you know that we tell stories where the line between right and wrong isn't clean. If these kinds of stories matter to you, consider subscribing, because what Ethan did next is the kind of moral territory that most people are afraid to explore honestly. Here is what you need to understand about pension fund accounting. These funds hold enormous sums of pooled money, contributions from hundreds or thousands of workers, invested over decades, intended to provide income in retirement. The accounting systems that manage these funds are sophisticated, but they are operated by human beings, and human beings, when sufficiently motivated, can find the seams. Ethan did not steal money, not in the crude sense. What he did was far more elegant and far more insidious. He created a series of what would later be described in court documents as allocation discrepancies. He reclassified certain fund transfers. He adjusted timing on investment redemptions. He created phantom administrative fees routed through shell accounts that existed only on paper for exactly long enough to move money from one place to another. Over the course of 11 weeks, Ethan siphoned $2.3 million from the pension fund he administered. The excess covered the treatment cost, medical travel, and the ancillary expenses that come with saving someone's life in a system that prices life like a luxury good. He told Sarah he had secured a combination of grants, loans, and an anonymous donor. She believed him because she wanted to believe him, and because Ethan had never given her a reason not to. The therapy was administered at a specialized center in Boston, a single infusion, 4 hours. Sarah lay in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and a line of genetically modified viral particles entering her bloodstream, each one carrying a corrected copy of the gene that had been trying to end her life. Ethan sat beside her and held her hand. A nurse monitored her vitals. The television in the corner played a cooking competition on mute. That was it. That was the moment a life was saved. It was remarkably undramatic. Within 3 months, Sarah's motor function stabilized. Within 6, it began improving. Her grip strength returned. She stopped dropping things. She went back to work. She helped a 9-year-old girl with cerebral palsy learn to use parallel bars, and when the girl took her first independent steps, Sarah cried in the break room and called Ethan and said, "I'm here. I'm still here." The therapy worked. The cure took. And somewhere in a filing cabinet at Hargrove and Bloom, 11 weeks of fraudulent transactions waited like a dormant virus of their own. Sarah's father, Richard Whitfield, had been a municipal transit worker for 31 years. He drove a bus on the M15 route in Manhattan. He woke up at 4 in the morning. He navigated traffic that would make most people weep. He did this without complaint, without fanfare, and without any expectation of recognition. What he did expect, what he had been promised, was that the money deducted from every paycheck for 3 decades would be there when he retired. Richard Whitfield was a member of Transit Workers Union Local 314. Transit Workers Union Local 314's pension fund was administered by Hargrove and Bloom. Ethan knew this. He had known this from the beginning. The fund he drained was not a random target. It was not selected by cold strategic calculation. It was the fund he had primary access to. It was the fund whose systems he understood intimately. And it was the fund that held the retirement security of his future father-in-law and every person Richard Whitfield had worked beside for 3 decades. This is the detail that transforms this story from a tale of desperate love into something much harder to categorize. Ethan did not rob a faceless institution. He robbed the specific people who raised the woman he was trying to save. 14 months after the treatment, an external audit flagged irregularities in the Local 314 pension fund. The auditors traced the discrepancies. The shell accounts were discovered. The phantom fees were unwound, and Ethan Caldwell's name surfaced at the center of every fraudulent transaction. Ethan was terminated. Then he was arrested. Then he was released on bail. Sarah learned the truth, not from Ethan, not from a lawyer, from her father. Richard called on a Wednesday evening. His voice was the voice of a man trying to hold something enormous inside a space too small to contain it. The union had sent a letter. The pension fund had experienced significant unauthorized withdrawals. Benefits might be reduced, retirement timelines might be extended. An investigation was underway. Sarah listened. She asked questions. She searched Ethan's name in the public court records database, and she found everything. She did not scream. She did not throw things. She sat on the edge of their bed in the apartment Ethan had moved them into 3 months earlier, a bright, modern one-bedroom with hardwood floors and a view of the river, and she understood with perfect and annihilating clarity the architecture of her own survival. Her health had been purchased with her father's future. Her functioning hands, the hands that held children upright, the hands that had stopped dropping things, those hands had been paid for with the retirement funds of bus drivers and maintenance workers who had spent their lives believing the system would keep its promises. What happened next did not happen quickly. It happened in the way that structural damage happens, slowly, silently, and then all at once. Ethan pleaded guilty. His attorney negotiated a reduced sentence, 18 months in a minimum security facility, restitution payments that would take the rest of his professional life. He accepted everything. He apologized to the court, to the union, to the fund's beneficiaries. He did not apologize to Sarah, because Sarah had not asked him to. She had not asked him for anything at all. But here is what no one outside that apartment ever knew. Here is the part of this story that lives in the space between what we show the world and what we carry alone. Sarah did not leave Ethan. She wanted to. She planned to. She drafted the words in her head 1,000 times, but every time she reached the moment of speaking them, she was stopped by a question that had no answer. Can you return a cure? If she left Ethan, it would not undrain the pension fund. It would not restore her father's retirement. It would not reverse the gene therapy now permanently integrated into her cellular machinery. The corrected genes were part of her. The stolen money was part of her. There was no version of her body that was innocent, and so she stayed. And in staying, she discovered emotions that no one prepares you for. The quiet fury of gratitude, the shame of being healthy, the realization that love and resentment can occupy the same heartbeat without canceling each other out. She caught herself, some mornings, looking at Ethan across the breakfast table and feeling something she could only describe as allergic to his presence, not hatred, something worse, a low-grade, constant awareness that every comfortable breath she took had been financed by someone else's loss. Ethan, for his part, carried his own invisible weight. He had expected to feel guilty. What he had not expected was to feel righteous. Some part of him, a part he never spoke aloud, a part he buried beneath apologies and restitution checks. He believed he had done the right thing. He had saved her. The system had failed her. He had not. And that belief, that small, unshakable conviction, was perhaps the most dangerous thing in the apartment. Richard Whitfield retired 2 years later than planned. His benefits were reduced by 23%. He moved from his 3-bedroom house in Queens to a 1-bedroom apartment in New Jersey. He never spoke to Ethan again. He spoke to Sarah every Sunday, but their conversations had a new quality, a carefulness, a deliberate avoidance of certain subjects that functioned as its own kind of wall. Sarah visited her father in his new apartment and noticed the things that were missing. The recliner he'd had since she was 12, the dining table where they'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner for 20 years, the bookshelves. He'd sold them, not because he wanted to, because 23% of a bus driver's pension is the difference between comfort and calculation. She sat in his living room, healthy and strong and breathing easily, and she performed the moral arithmetic that had become the background noise of her existence. Her lungs worked because his retirement didn't. Her muscles fired because his savings account had been emptied. The gene therapy that rebuilt her body had, in a very real sense, dismantled his life. There is a principle in bioethics called distributive justice. It asks a simple question: how should benefits and burdens be fairly distributed? Ethan had answered that question with terrifying clarity. He had distributed the burden of Sarah's disease onto the people least equipped to bear it. He had taken the cost of one person's cure and spread it across hundreds of people who had never consented to carry it. And the most devastating part? It worked. Sarah was healthy. The therapy was permanent. The cure was real. This is the cruelty at the center of this story. If the therapy had failed, if the money had been wasted, the moral calculus would be simpler. Tragedy compounded by tragedy. But the therapy succeeded, and success made everything infinitely more complicated. Ethan served his sentence. He came home. He found work as a freelance bookkeeper because no financial firm would touch him. Sarah continued her career in pediatric rehabilitation. They paid the restitution. They lived modestly by most standards and extravagantly by the standards of the peoples whose money they had taken. And they stayed together. Not happily, not unhappily. They stayed together in the way that two people stay together when they have survived something that no one else could possibly understand. They were bound not by love alone, but by complicity, by the shared knowledge of what they were willing to accept in exchange for her life. If this story has made you think, really think, about the impossible choices people face when the system fails them, then this channel is built for you. We go deep into the stories that don't have clean answers. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Some evenings they sit on their small balcony and watch the river. They don't talk about the pension fund. They don't talk about her father's downsized apartment. They don't talk about the fact that somewhere in Queens, a retired sanitation worker is choosing between medication and groceries because a column in a spreadsheet was deliberately misaligned. They talk about dinner. They talk about a show they're watching. They talk about the weather. Sarah breathes easily. Her hands are steady. Her body is, by every clinical measure, healthy. And that health sits between them like a beautiful object that was taken from a burning building. Saved, yes, but carrying the scent of everything that was lost in the fire. There is no moral to this story. There is only the question it leaves behind, and it is a question that none of us can answer with certainty until we're the ones sitting in the fluorescent-lit office, holding the hand of the person we love most, listening to a doctor attach a price tag to survival. Ethan broke the law. That is not in dispute. He stole from working people. He violated trust. He committed fraud. By every legal and institutional standard, he is guilty. But he saved her life, and she is alive. And her father is alive too, in a smaller apartment, with a smaller life, carrying a burden he never agreed to carry. The gene therapy works by delivering a corrected gene through a viral vector that integrates permanently into the patient's DNA. You cannot reverse it. You cannot extract it. The cure becomes part of the person, indistinguishable from the body it saved. In a very real, very biological sense, Sarah cannot give it back. She cannot undo what was done to save her. She can only live with it. And perhaps that is the most honest metaphor for what this story is really about. We are all, in ways large and small, living with things we cannot give back, advantages we did not earn, comforts built on someone else's compromise, safety purchased with someone else's risk. Ethan and Sarah's story is extreme, but the question it asks is not. What would you be willing to take, and from whom, to save the person you love? If the cure existed, but the cost would fall on someone who trusts you, someone who raised you, someone who has no idea what you're about to do, would you do it? And if you did, if you took the money, administered the cure, watched the color return to her face and the strength return to her hands, could you live in the apartment that your decision built? Could you eat breakfast across from the person you saved, knowing the geometry of suffering that made that breakfast possible? Could you sit on the balcony, watch the river, and call it peace? Ethan can. Sarah is still deciding. And perhaps that is the most honest thing this story has to say. The person who committed the act sleeps soundly. The person who was saved by it lies awake. The cure is permanent. So is the cost. Tell me in the comments, was Ethan right? Not legally, you know the legal answer, but morally, in the deepest, most honest part of yourself, where the rules you follow in daylight dissolve into the fears you carry in the dark. Was he right? And if you say no, if you say he should have let the system work, let the appeals play out, let the wait lists move, let the clock run down on a body that was running out of time, then answer one more question. Would you say the same thing if it were your person lying in that hospital bed?